In this video, I'm going to cover signal flow, monitoring, and routing in Ableton Live. In layman's terms, I'm going to explain how to get the signal into different tracks, whether that be audio or MIDI. Then I'll also explain how we can route it out of the tracks and all the different locations that we can send it to. Firstly, we need to make sure we can see the input and output section of the mixer. This is hidden by default. To show the input-output, or I/O section, click the I/O button in the bottom right of the screen. We can also do this from the View menu at the top left of the screen, or we can use the shortcut Command-Option-I. Now we can see the inputs and outputs of each track. Notice that for MIDI tracks it says MIDI from and MIDI to, and for audio tracks it says audio from and audio to. Here we can select where the signal comes from using the drop-down menus. Next we have the monitoring section. This decides how the signal is going to be monitored as it passes through the track. Underneath this we have the output section. This decides where the audio will go to when leaving the track from the drop-down menu. We can send the track output to a number of locations, the most common being the master. We can also send it to the external output of your sound card, or we can send it directly to the input of another track. In this case, we're going to route track 1's output into the input of track 2. We can also create a group bus or submix simply by grouping tracks together. As you can see, the two individual tracks' output sections have now been changed to group to show that they've been submixed to the group bus. We can still reroute this audio from one of the tracks in the group to a different location if we wish. With our MIDI information, we can send our MIDI outputs to another MIDI track, a MIDI device, or an output port. Notice the dotted lines on the MIDI track's volume fader. If we put an instrument on a MIDI track, this will now change to an audio fader. The output will also now change to audio as well, due to the instrument now outputting audio rather than MIDI. The input section determines where we're going to be capturing our audio from. We have a variety of options, from external, in which will usually be your sound card. We can also have resampling, other tracks' outputs, or we can even set the track to have no input. Next we've got our MIDI tracks. By default, their inputs are set to all ins. This means that provided the track is armed, all MIDI devices can send MIDI information to this track. At the moment I'm playing in using my keyboard, but we could also set this to listen to the computer keyboard, or a specific MIDI device, or we could set it to no MIDI input so it won't listen for any MIDI. Finally, we can also capture MIDI from other MIDI tracks. The monitoring section determines how signals are passed through the track. We can choose between in, auto, and off. By default, the auto monitoring mode is selected. If the track is auto enabled and record armed, which is the little red bottom at the bottom of the track, then we'll always be able to hear the track's input. If we set the monitoring to in and we disarm this track, it will now be set up as an auxiliary track. This means we'll now always be able to monitor the signal going through this track. This is especially useful for splitting devices such as Impulse, so each sample has its own dedicated channel for effects and mixing. Finally, we have off, which permanently disables input monitoring for that selected channel. To demonstrate this, I'll now select my microphone from the audio input. With auto selected and record armed, we can now monitor our input. We can now also record a clip. We can also change the monitoring to in and disarm record enable. This now monitors the track's input live, as you can hear. Finally, we can set the input to off, which permanently disables input monitoring on that track. Next, I'll show you the master track on the far right of the screen. Once again, we have an audio output selector, which can go to the stereo out, which is outputs 1 and 2, or we can set this to another channel on our sound card. Next, we have the Q output. This can be set so it's the same as the master output, or it can be set to a dedicated output on your sound card. This is especially useful for live DJing or being able to hear a metronome in headphones. The metronome's output also comes through the Q monitor. Now I'll demonstrate the routing possibilities in live. Here I have two MIDI tracks that are both set to auto. We also have track 3 with a series of effects applied to it. I'd like to layer my two MIDI tracks together and use the same MIDI information. There's a number of ways we can do this. To do this, we'll have to route track 2 to receive the MIDI information from track 1. We'll also have to set track 2's monitoring to input. We can now also affect track 1 and 2 by grouping them and affecting the group. Alternatively, we can route track 3's input to receive audio from track 1 and 2's submix. You must also set track 3's monitoring to in. We can now adjust the wet-dry of track 3 by using the volume fader to bring the affected signal in and out of the mix. We can also capture and recapture MIDI information. For example, if we put an arpeggiator on track 2, we can make a new MIDI track and we can set the input to receive MIDI from track 2. This will enable us to capture the arpeggiated MIDI information for further processing into our new track. To recap, in this session we've taken a look at input and output routing, monitoring modes, and also routing and signal flow capabilities. In the next video, we're going to take a closer look at the building blocks of live, clips.